Good afternoon to the East Coast. Good morning to the West Coast. Those of you in the Midwest are on your own for now. Very happy to welcome you to a surprise, emergent, and howdy-do webinar to sort of round off the work we've been doing in Unit 3 of Connected Courses. This unit has been on the web as a platform, as a culture, as a concept, and been thinking a lot about web literacy. And that's really the ongoing topic that we're exploring. In today's session in particular, we're going to be exploring it from a viewpoint that I think may help to synthesize some of what we've done so far in the unit and maybe push into some new areas of consideration. So very happy to have you with us today, and very happy to have also with us Jon Udell, who has been working for various aspects of the computer industry as well as the public good, I would say, for many decades now. Someone who contributed to the success of Byte magazine back in the day, and has most recently been working for Microsoft Corporation with some stints in between here and there, and someone whose work as a blogger and as a thinker about the web has been exceptionally influential for me and for a number of my colleagues in higher ed. If you follow Jim Groom, you'll know that he talks about Jon a lot as well. Howard Reingold is here also as a person who is a co-facilitator and I would say co-leader overall of the Connected Courses experience, someone who is well known to you, needs no introduction, but has certainly been a powerful force in technology literacy, technology journalism, and some of the what I would think of as the higher order thinking around these topics for many, many years. And I'm Gardner Campbell. I'm at Virginia Commonwealth University here in sunny RVA, Richmond, Virginia, as I speak to you. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I thought it would be an interesting conversation to have because I was left with a nagging feeling. I hate to project my nagging feelings onto others, but I kept thinking, you know, we've talked a lot about web literacy. We've managed to steer around the idea that web literacy is simply mastering a number of procedures, protocols, or link skills. We've talked about the culture of the web. We've talked about what sorts of things actually help us to constitute a community on the web. But I kept thinking, there's something that we haven't quite explored about what's unique to the environment of the web itself. That's at that interesting hybrid point between technological affordance and human community and interaction. And I know no one who articulates that kind of thing better than Jon Udell and his idea of this fourth R, thinking like the web. What is it that the web presents that's genuinely new in human experience? So I was very eager to try to talk with him if possible and add this to the rich content of Connected Courses. And the planets aligned. Everything worked so far, knock on wood. And we're very happy to have Jon with us today. So, Jon, welcome.
Thank you.
And here's what I will lead off with. You and I have discussed this many times, and I've been trying very hard over the last 36 hours or so to boil this down for the first kind of topic of consideration. So here's what I've got. One of the things that you pointed out a lot, and you're not the only one to do this, but you've done it in an especially articulate way, is that part of our puzzlement about the web, or perhaps our lack of using the web effectively, has to do with the fact that it offers experiences and affordances that we don't have ready analogies for in our experience of the physical world. We have developed a set of intuitions about the way the world ought to work, in large part because of the way we come into contact with the world in a tangible sense. But the web, which is now helping to define our world, doesn't have that same set of analogies to draw on. So I would love to hear from you how you feel about that, how you're thinking about that, and just explore that particular disjunction in some depth.
Yeah, the physics are different and surprising. And although we've been habituating to this for a couple of decades now, we've got a million years of evolution behind us when things that are possible now weren't possible. And it's just not in our DNA in a deep way. So I think maybe the best and easiest example of this is the hashtag for this course. Right? I mean, it's such a simple thing. We take it for granted. but what is it? It's 8 characters. C courses, right? Is that 8 characters plus the hashtag? And what is that, right? I mean, it's just a made-up word, but it doesn't just mean something, it does something. And the thing that it does is coordinate a bunch of streams of communication, not only on Twitter, but elsewhere, right? If you search Google or Bing for Sharp C courses, you'll find blog posts, you'll find other kinds of things. So this notion that a word that we just made up and then invested with meaning, and that the meaning is that this is a way to draw a community together for a particular purpose, is utterly unprecedented, right? And those of us who've been in the sort of a world where we take it for granted that the first order of business at a conference is to announce the tag for the conference, I think need to step back and understand how profoundly different that is from all of prior human experience, and what it really takes to get that understanding woven into everyone's experience.
I would add that it's very web-like that the hashtag was not invented by Twitter, but by a user, and I think that illustrates another example that we're really not accustomed to, although I don't think it's impossible in the pre-web world, which is the enterprise and its customer, I suppose, somehow symbiotically can create communities that maybe wasn't in the mind of the people who created the communication platform. That there's a kind of strange collaboration between the people who are trying to, whether it's for profit like Twitter or non-profit like Wikipedia, the people who provide what we now call platforms, the people who use it, and kind of communities in this supersaturated solution that something like a hashtag or a Wikipedia page can pull together.
Yeah, it's important to note that, as you say, the hashtag wasn't something that Twitter invented. It was something that a user invented, and in fact, it wasn't even something that came from Twitter. It originally was an IRC convention, and it probably has roots going farther back than that. And a key point here is that the web, among other things, is what Eric von Hippel at MIT would call a user innovation toolkit, which is to say it's an environment that enables people to do things, but as they use the tools in the environment, they can express intentions that weren't understood by the creators of the platform. And as they express those intentions through the use of the tools in that environment, they can shape the tools in the environment, right? And that actually, again, is not in itself special to the web. I mean, von Hippel did a bunch of research about other communities of practice where what he called lead users shaped the evolution of the technology, including things like surfboards, right? So, but it is critical that the web, as we know and love it, has been a user innovation toolkit, and I think we all understand that we are in some danger of losing some of those aspects of it as we increasingly package things up.
So I want to follow up with what you've said about the lead users, because that's really very interesting. Lead users in the past were typically confined to a particular geographical area or a particular substratum of the culture, but now the potential to be a lead user by sparking an innovation in something as humble as a hashtag that can nevertheless become suddenly an organization without an organization. That's brand new, and one of the ironies is it answers a human need that we've long complained about with regard to the lack of agility in human beings collaborating and organizing with each other. And yet, there's something about that possibility that's so enormous that it's almost invisible. You've done a lot to try to make that visible to people, Jon, but as you talk to people, what's getting them stuck? What's the bridge part that's not there for them to understand it's not this screen, it's not this keyboard, it's what's available to us now in terms of human possibility?
Yeah, so I've struggled with this, and the conclusion I've come to is that in the end, this is not something that you can explain to people. You can't talk to people. You can't show them even pictures or movies, although that helps, right? I mean, the Wikipedia screencast that I made was a very helpful way to give people a sense of what the Wikipedia culture and process is like. And for a lot of people, I've been told that was an eye-opener in terms of kind of rocking Wikipedia. But still, in the end, I think ultimately, until you give people an experience that directly involves them, their own information, their own data, their own relationships, and their own work or creative processes, right? Until you actually embed them in that world in a way that gives them the experience of using the tools and experiencing the effects, it doesn't really sink in. And so that's been really my overriding challenge in recent years is, how can we put people into the driver's seat?
Well, and what's been ironic is I've watched the work you've done with community calendaring, which would seem to be an extremely low threshold, high yield way of demonstrating what that driver's seat is all about. It's almost as if there are things in the environment which people have simply accepted as broken and inefficient, and that is now like the firmness of the earth. It's just the way it is.
Yeah.
Talk some about that experience you've had with trying to find that low threshold, high yield moment, and still the experience, even when you're in it, somehow doesn't make that connection. Or maybe sometimes it does.
Well, it does when I'm able to actually put people into the driver's seat. But I haven't been able to scale out that process, right? I've been doing it one-on-one or one to small groups, right? I haven't been able to scale it out, and there are lots of obstacles that I've run into. But one of the touchstone stories for me is the high school in my former hometown of Keene, where to this day the calendar on the school's website is a PDF file. And when I went to talk to the principal of the school to try to explain to him that that there is such a thing as web standards, and one of those standards is for the exchange of calendar information, right? And that there is this notion that there are structures of information that are represented properly in some standards and not other standards, for some uses and not other uses. It was an utterly alien concept. And what was really depressing to me was, that those were the sorts of literacies that I would hope the school would be teaching my kids, right? And but we don't, in general, articulate or teach those fundamental literacies. That information can have structure, that the web, in part, functions through the exchange of information that complies with defined standards for one or another type of data, right? And a set of other things that we've talked about a lot, and I tried to codify in that essay about 7 ways to think like the web, which, by the way, I want to thank Doug Belshaw at the Mozilla Foundation, who's the web literacy lead there, for sort of distilling that down into, I think, a more digestible set of best practices. But still, right, until we put people into the driver's seat, I don't think that the light bulbs are going to go off in the way that we need them to.
So you're talking about people in driver's seats. I can easily imagine the response because I've heard it myself. But Jon, I'm not about technology. I'm about people. I don't really understand how computers work. I don't know how my car works. I just want to be able to drive it. So you're telling me about a driver's seat, but I have to learn something to even get in the car? What's that about?
Yeah. Yep. And again, I've had these experiences one-on-one. A friend has a relative who is an author, and the author would say, "I'm not a technical person, and I don't care how the computer works," and that sort of thing. But she had a great interest in tracking her own reputation online relative to the books that she had written. And so when we showed her some simple things that we take for granted, like, oh, you can run a search on the web, and then you can take a feed of the results of that search and put it into a tool that will update you with new information as the search finds new information, right? So, that isn't coding per se, right? But when people talk about teaching everybody to code, that's the kind of thing that I imagine we ought to be teaching first, right? I don't think everybody first needs to know how to write code in JavaScript or another programming language. But I do think everybody needs to understand how to compose online systems made of components which can be connected by you without any special knowledge or experience, but just with an appreciation of the fact that that's how things can work, right? You can plug things together, and you can create tools that meet your information needs, right? That make you a more powerful actor in the world. That's the kind of literacy, and that's the kind of coding sensibility that I would want to most encourage and first.
The irony of this issue of people saying, I'm really not a technical person, why should I learn how to use the web, is that the web was such a wonderful step that enabled people who weren't technical people to use the internet.
Yeah.
You don't have to go through any kind of technical steps in order to move from one internet site to another. You click on a link. You don't have to go through some kind of command line arcana to do things on the web. There are forms for that. I think it's a little bit like saying, well, I don't intend to be a published author. Why should I learn to read and write? We're living in a literate world. If you don't read and write, you are disempowering yourself.
Yes.
You're not going to be necessarily choose a career of literature. You are participating in the power that the literate community conveys on everyone who goes through quite a bit of trouble to learn to read and write. It's a whole lot easier to learn to put these pieces together. I think David Weinberger's analogy of small pieces loosely joined. Once you learn how the web is like a toolkit of really simple things, you don't have to understand how they work. But if you can understand how to push them around and plug them together, you can do all kinds of things.
You can. I do think we need to appreciate the way in which, though we're swimming upstream relative to our million years of evolution. And so one of my touchstone examples there, again, relative to this community calendar project, is that one of the key literacies I want people to internalize is that when you read and write on the web, what writing can and should mean ultimately is that you are colonizing your own space on the web primarily, right? Because your information is your information, and ultimately you are authoritatively in control of it, or you would want to be, right? And then you also want it to appear in other places. And that has turned out to be a subtle and really, really perplexing challenge. So the way community calendars work to this day is people, even though they now typically have their own calendars online, maybe on their Facebook page, maybe on their blog, maybe on their group's website, whatever, right? So they're already writing a calendar, okay? But then when they want to publicize the calendar, they think it's natural, and there are unfortunately many aggregators and publishers in the world who think it's natural for them to be expected to go to some other place and retype the same information and do that again and again. And one of the reasons why people find this to be a natural thing is because that's how, in the physical world, we transfer things. So if I give you something, right? If I've got a coin in my pocket and I want to give it to you, I take it out of my pocket and I hand it to you, right? Now I've given it to you and it's not in my pocket anymore, right? We have a million years of experience with that kind of a transaction. The kind of a transaction where I say, here's a coin, I'm going to point to the coin, and I'm going to give you a pointer to the coin, and now we're both pointing to the coin, and we can both use it, and other effects can happen around that coin, but it actually hasn't gone from my hand to your hand, right? That's a new transaction. We don't have fundamentally deep experience with that yet, and so when we try to build a web of small parts loosely connected, right? One of the fundamental enablers is this idea of syndication, which requires that you appreciate that basic idea, right? That it's what programmers call passing by reference versus passing by value, and it's actually a subtle and difficult thing to get people to appreciate. And again, that's why in the end I find that only once you give them the experience, right? Oh, look what happened here. I typed stuff up into my Google Calendar, right, that I maintain for my own reasons and that I project onto my own website, and then without me doing anything else, it also is appearing in the community-wide calendar, right? And when they see that happen, and they understand that the information was syndicated from one place to another, and that it's their information, and if they change it upstream, it'll appear downstream in all the other locations as they would want, then again the light bulb goes off. But very hard for me to again scale out putting people into that situation. It's been a real frustration for me. I'd appreciate your thoughts as to how we can scale that kind of experience out.
So there's a really great comment in the Twitter stream right now from Greg McFerry. I hope I pronounced that right. Greg, shout out. And it's an interesting little moment because it's just dead on what you're talking about. Greg writes, I draw a difference. I'm putting some articles in there to flesh out the 140 characters. I draw a difference between writing for the web, coding for meaning, versus building for web, coding for infrastructure. And that's a distinction that makes sense until, for me, I read the words George Dyson wrote in Turing's Cathedral, where he says, when we got the computer, the distinction between numbers that meant something and numbers that did something collapsed, and everything changed. So I guess another way of putting that in terms of Greg's comment is that coding for infrastructure can no longer be, and that's kind of a cool thing, can no longer be so sharply distinguished from what we would call writing ordinarily, coding for meaning. That infrastructure becomes like a kind of language in a way. There's a weird middle part there where it's hard to say that they're different.
Yeah, no, that's really true. And I've still really been unable to convey the profound power of tags in all contexts. But for me, initially it was in the context of a service called Delicious, which is now not what it once was, but it was in the context of Delicious that I discovered that there were really powerful methods of information management, which were ultimately driven entirely by names and conventions around the selection and use of names. And that kinds of systems that programmers would expect would need to be built by creating databases, writing queries, were actually possible in a completely emergent way with no programming other than thoughtful use of names. And that remains true. It's what happens when people get together around tags on Twitter, but it's more profound than that. And it's one of those literacies that you have to give people the experience of using and being surprised by the power of the results before they really kind of get it.
If you zoom back on the power of the tag to aggregate a community, which can then quite often get something done together, what we're really talking about is using pretty simple things. I mean, are you really going through any kind of difficulty to come up with a hashtag that would attract a community of interest and then maybe hold a tweet chat that would draw those people together? That's really 99% social, 1% knowing that you can use a hashtag and a tweet chat to do that. In terms of collective intelligence, it reminds me of a term that's kind of esoteric, stigmergy, that refers to the way individual ants don't really have brains, but anthills can have very sophisticated ways of organizing food-seeking logistics, and they can build nests. The mind of the anthill is not in the individual ant, but the ants leave little chemical trails when they go hunting for food, and if they find the food, they go straight back to the nest and they leave a trail, and if another ant stumbles over that trail, they will follow it and strengthen it, and when the food source runs out, the trail evaporates. What they're doing is they are leaving little signals as they go about their behavior, and those signals reconfigure the environment, and the environment's new configuration tells people what to do, and in order to do something like find food or build a nest. And together we are learning how to use simple signals to build collective intelligence, just as we learned to use words to speak with and letters to write with. I think we are putting together very powerful vocabulary, just as Doug Engelbart predicted that we've got this automated symbol manipulation system. It's not, you don't have to look under the hood. The hood makes it possible for you to get someone from Kazakhstan and someone from Argentina who share a particular esoteric interest into a conversation with you instantaneously. I think that, you know, it's very important for people to understand that is a power, and it does not take too much technical knowledge.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that process in many ways draws on the natural language of humanity and the way language evolves, right? So you see these vocabularies of tags, and some take root and some don't. Just like some words, you know, catch on and other words don't in natural language. It's very organic that way, and it is in fact why it does work.
So this is irresistible to me because I've got two of my favorite writers here in the room with me. So I want to push at this analogy a little bit. We've been using the word literacy. We've been thinking about how organic many of these webbed affordances are in analogy, analogous to language itself instead of moving parts and technical stuff. And I'm recalling what Kim Jackson, one of our facilitators for this unit, said very poignantly, probably last week, I believe it was, Kim, you can correct me on Twitter here. There are models of teaching literacy that are entirely mechanical. If you get the grammar right, if you can master the comma splice, not doing it, if you memorize all these rules, now you're literate because you can write a well-formed sentence. But I would wager, and I want to hear you and Howard talk about this, John, that your experience of writing is not driven by thinking about language that way. So let me put it as a question. As the two of you write, what are you thinking about? What is the experience of literacy for you in that moment as you write something?
Okay, I'll jump on that. First, you know, one of the things that I talk to my students about in regards to writing on the web is the distinction between an audience and a market and a public. And of course, journalism gets into a lot of trouble when a journalist is writing for a market rather than a public. I think the preponderance of Ebola coverage is a good example of journalism going way south on that. Yes, people are very interested in it. Does it really deserve that much coverage? It really has to do with the market. The difference between an audience and a public is that audiences used to be for the few who could broadcast, you know, whether you are singing or writing or you are on television, to a large number of people who you don't really ever communicate with. Maybe they're fans and you will give them autographs. Publics, when you are writing a blog post, you are writing for people who can potentially respond to you. They can comment, they can link to you, they can write a long blog post about why you don't know what you're talking about. They could join you in collective action if you want to organize something. So as a professional writer, I had to understand who my public was, and I no longer really think about that so much, but I would say that when I write in a particular venue, if I'm writing for my students, or I'm writing for the web, if I'm writing for a blog, I have in mind that there are people out there who could be activated by this, who I am feeding something and who could feed me, who could sharpen my ideas by pointing out how they are wrong. And I think that being able to keep different publics in mind is one of the arts of communicating online well. And you know, you'll see it if you go to LiveJournal, you'll see a different world. There are many different publics that you can find on Twitter who are communicating with each other and have different signals and languages.
So maybe I'll take this from the perspective of folks who are not and never will be professional writers, but who could be communicating online in ways that they often don't. And Gardner, you remember my experience from a few years ago talking to faculty at a couple of different universities, asking them what was their use of their own blogs to articulate what they did professionally, and the answer being, well, we don't do that because we wouldn't want to publish half-baked ideas. You know, so from my point of view, I would like everyone who is, you know, if we want to take the Ebola example, right? You know, we're seeing a lot of information that's filtered through journalism, but the primary sources are not speaking for themselves nearly to the extent that I would want them to, right? So, I mean, why, if I am a public health official, if I am a scientist, if I am, you know, one of the first responders, you know, why am I not actually the source of, or a source of primary information? And I think, you know, still we're not nearly to the point where folks in those situations feel empowered, or the organizations that they work for feel that it is appropriate for that to happen, right? But I mean, ultimately, those are the authorities, right? Journalism, in my view, should be able to weave together from a rich array of authoritative sources a story that advances the story, right? And we're still not nearly there yet.
So I'm going to try to sharpen the question, especially since Kim has chimed in and said that this is really the way that her remark was going. So I want to push it a little bit more. And this is all to build on what you've said already. You were both in school. You both learned how to read and write. Clearly the technical skills, if you want to call it that, play a part in your experience of writing. But your experience of writing, I think, given what I know of both of you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is not simply about mastery of a set of skills. It's a set of intuitions you've both developed about the possibilities for your own use of language. And I just wonder, I mean, Howard was getting at this with his idea of activation, but there may be even more to explore here. What do you imagine is happening when you use a social construct like language for what you want to communicate as an individual? I'm going to say that's part of the heart of this mystery of the web as a language.
I don't think I understand the question.
Shall I try again? You did not invent language. Okay, it's a social construction. We put it together as a species. But you use that medium, and you experience both the thing that you want to say and the way that saying might have an effect on the universe as you're writing. I mean, maybe you don't think about it consciously that way, but I'm curious. I mean, this is, I'm trying, and if Kim, you can jump in here at some point. You have the link if you want to use it. My question is this: if we want to encourage people to be web literate, what is the experiential context of that might be analogous to the way the two of you experience writing? Are there analogies there that we can draw?
Okay, well, I will say that I've, for a long time, I think, been too focused on the process of writing because I am a writer, and have lost sight of the degree to which that's not the primary mode of expression for a lot of folks, right? And so I think all of us who are literary need to kind of appreciate that, right? And to think about how other people express themselves, other people who may be very uncomfortable thinking of themselves as writers or committing words to electrons, but have other modes of expression. And I mean, for me, actually, I mean, the beautiful example of this is what you can see happening on YouTube in so many ways. I mean, just just the other day, I had a situation where I had a chair, a beloved body-built chair that I've had for 15 years, that broke, and I had the replacement part shipped to me. It was really unclear what I was going to do to fix this chair because, long story short, the guy at Bodybuilt sent me a video, and it's just basically illustrated, here's how hard you have to hit the thing with the hammer to pop the part out, right? And it was ideal, right? The guy would have been very uncomfortable writing an explanation about how to do that, but he was very comfortable showing me how to do it. And you know, if you are interested in learning music, as I am, the degree to which performances of any tune that you want to learn are available to you from so many different sources and so many different styles on YouTube is remarkable. So I don't know if that helps.
You know, I would say that the word literacy in this case is a little bit misleading because, as John pointed out, it's not just writing. I would say that the most important thing when I'm trying to bring students aboard this idea that they can use the web is the idea of agency and the ability to get something for yourself. So you don't have to write. You could correct some punctuation on Wikipedia. You could link to something important for a community that matters to you. If you suddenly come down with a disease or suddenly you have a baby, you can connect with a community of people who can help you with whatever issues you have. You need to learn how to do something. You can find a 14-year-old on YouTube who will show you how to do it, or you can teach people how to do what it is you do. You can
Exactly.
You can cultivate a personal learning network. You can have your own think tank of experts in the fields that interest you who can advise you and who you can advise.
Exactly.
There are all kinds of ways that activities that don't necessarily take a great deal of technical expertise, but take your interest in a particular subject and use that the way the hashtag is used to activate individuals and communities to help you. Now, of course,
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, everybody is an expert on something. And you know, we're in a world now where it's possible for anyone to make their expertise available to the world. And so there's beginning to be an ethos that supports the doing of that. When you want to do it, there are things that you ought to know about how best to do it, right? How to be most effective. You know, there are a set of principles that are general, and then there are ones that are particular to the discipline, be it the form of words, the form of audio or video, or you know, performance. But yeah, you know, you need to understand that you know something that matters to more people, and the threshold is pretty low for you to be able to make that available to those other people. When you do that, among other things, it's quite likely that you'll connect with those other people, which will be rewarding for everyone involved.
So this is great. It's getting to what my ill-formed question was not getting to very well. The sense that one of the experiences of literacy is for the potential for activation, as Howard calls it, the potential for agency, but also the fact that it could well matter to someone. The activity could have a purpose that I haven't imagined, but I have some faith that it could have a purpose. The first thing to do, though, is put it out there, because if I don't, by definition, the purpose will never emerge. So this brings me to a fond memory that I have of Jon Udell in my class a couple of years ago at Virginia Tech, helping a student in particular, Lizzie Kane, understand that in the act of writing on her blog and creating a link that was not yet returning anything, or actually just a coined word, that was not yet returning any result on Google, nevertheless she had set a chain of events in motion that could result in agency, effectiveness, and meaning because, again, of this idea of thinking like the web. So, Jon, you even blogged about that. That seemed to be an interesting and maybe paradigmatic experience of doing the thing prior to seeing the result that you anticipated. What was that like? You can probably tell the story better than I can.
Well, it was a beautiful thing. We suggested that anyone in the class might want to try the experiment of coining a word, searching, and determining that that word is not yet in the internet's index. Returns 0 results, right? And then just post something that contains the word and discover a day or so later, or however long it took, that lo and behold, right? Now you're the one hit on Google for that word. And then we had some great follow-on effects because that became a touchstone example. And, you know, I blogged about it, you probably did, other people got connected to it, right? So your student got to have a pretty magical experience.
Yeah, you've called that awakening a grain of sand. Why do you call it that?
Because it's just a word that's inert, like billions of other words that either do or don't exist, but could exist, like grains of sand, and every one of them is just there, potentially active, but inert until someone imbues it with meaning and lights it up. And anyone can do that with any word, any rendezvous point in cyberspace at any time. It's such a powerful thing that it's almost frightening and difficult to appreciate.
You know, I don't want us to leave out the activity of curation here. This is something that I'm trying to impress upon my students, is that if you know something, you're interested in something, you follow that thing, you spend time going through 100 websites and you pick out 1 or 2 that you think are really useful, if you share the results of your judgment about something that you spend a lot of time investigating, then you're creating a public good that's useful to everybody else who's interested in that particular thing. You know, enterprises use all kinds of search engine optimization tricks to bring people who are searching to their product. If you want to establish yourself and as having some expertise, and maybe you're not a PhD, and maybe you're not a vice president of a company, but you know a lot about something. If you curate that, if on a regular basis you say, I've gone through 100 different sites and here are 2 that are, I think, useful to others who are interested in this butterfly, people who are interested in that will find their way to you. So you're doing 2 things. You are improving the commons. You're not just filtering out the bad stuff. You are filtering up the good stuff. But you are also drawing people to you individually who share your interest. And not only are those people your public, they're going to begin feeding you as well.
Yes, but only if you conduct that curation in public. And the sort of navigation of the public-private boundary is actually another one of these, I think, fundamental literacies. So there are an awful lot of people who are doing that kind of curation for themselves. and doing it in a private space. One of the things people need to appreciate is that if there's nothing confidential or proprietary about that activity, then you might as well do it in a public space, even if it turns out that no one else cares, because there's no cost to you to doing it that way, but you create the possibility that others will appreciate it, others will connect to you, and it will in fact improve the commons. It won't necessarily improve the commons, but if you don't conduct that activity in a way that is accessible to the world, then there's no chance that it will. Right?
So we've had the experience of at least the possibility of a digital commons for, let's say, the 20 years or so that the web has been with us, depending on how you count the origin of it. And I'd be curious to know from both of you, what's your level of optimism and hope right now? We're looking at what seems to be a period of possible retrenchment for the web, from causes ranging from net neutrality to the preponderance of the app-driven model of networked interaction. I mean, where is our web, and what are its prospects over the next few years?
I'm worried. I do feel that we are backpedaling, and that the kinds of things I would want people to understand were easier to see than they are now, and are becoming progressively obscured by the siloization of social media, and, as you say, the sort of appification of software. Right? I mean, under the covers, it's still web standards and protocols, but it's harder to see and experience that stuff, and that makes me uncomfortable.
You know, the people who do scenario planning use the word critical uncertainty to talk about those things which could make it go either way. And I think that pretty strongly that the critical uncertainty today is whether a significant portion of the population will continue to understand what the ordinary people who built the web knew, which is that we can make this. You don't have to wait for some government or some corporation to do it. Now we've seen it's a natural development. We've seen Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple creating these really wonderful products and services that do it for us. What's dangerous is the threat of enclosure, the idea that you have to go to one of these commercial services in order to network with other people socially, in order to create something that you can share on the web. That's why this idea of web literacies, including participation just in tagging something, making your judgments public, even small things, the idea that you have agency and that you can create what the web ought to be, ought not to be lost, because the interests of enclosure benefit from that. And, you know, I'm not saying that there's some kind of evil conspiracy. That's just the nature of the enterprise. We need to maintain a kind of green space where people can continue to invent Twitter and search engines and other new things. I'm not saying that we should do away with these wonderful enterprises that give us a lot of power. I just don't think that we're going to have a generative web that's going to continue to empower people if a significant portion of the population does not take the power into our own hands.
Yeah, and this is why the domain of one's own idea, I think, is so important right now. Do I need to explain in this context what that's about, or does everyone?
Well.
Okay, so you know, once upon a time, maybe mostly still, it was the idea that when you say went to university, you would have an EDU email account, and your sort of web presence and identity would be conferred upon you by the university. the idea that's emerging is, well, that doesn't really make any sense because I had a web identity now and a presence online before I showed up at the university, and it's part of my life experience that I bring with me. I pass through the institution, I come out the other end, and I still have that web identity and presence. So why shouldn't the institution, in this case the university, recognize and encourage that? And that's what Jim Broom has been campaigning for in recent years. I'm delighted to see this. And so, you know, I think originally University of Mary Washington, and now it's spread to other places, they're actively encouraging students to establish their own web identities if they don't already have them, and then to colonize those spaces and to try to exist there primarily and understand that when they pass through the context of the university or later in life they pass through the context of a professional organization, that the way to think about it is I control my stuff, it's in my space on the web, and I need to understand as part of my stewardship of my own identity online that I have to have tools and infrastructure that enable me to syndicate or connect into these other contexts as appropriate without losing control of my own stuff. That's profoundly empowering, and I'm really happy to see that there is this movement afoot, and I just applaud it and am rooting like crazy for this to take hold.
Well, as is often the case, the technological change you're describing is at heart primarily a cultural change. And so I'd put this to you here in the context of a hangout that we're doing that's creating an open educational resource that hopefully will continue to have some resonance within a community of educators. What do the two of you see as people who have been involved in and out with higher ed in various contexts over the course of your careers? What are the cultural barriers that you see in higher ed? Maybe the last place this argument can really be made in a powerful way. What are the things that you would say need to change or we need to do to encourage more of the kind of adoption that you're describing, a commitment to the commons?
Well, I'll jump in by saying that I think that first of all, what's becoming very clear is the distinction between the knowledge factory university and the teaching institution. And I'm all for knowledge factories. If there's going to be a cure for cancer, it's probably going to come from something like that. But if you talk about the two places I've taught, UC Berkeley, they invented the atomic bomb. Stanford, they invented Silicon Valley. The teaching enterprise is central, but it's maybe, I don't know the numbers, $100 million business. The research enterprise at those places, and dozens of others, are multi-billion-dollar businesses, and there are reasons for that. There was some legislation some years ago that enabled universities to own intellectual property in ways that they weren't able to before, and the rich get richer. Meanwhile, are we seeing the pedagogical innovations coming from Stanford and Princeton and Harvard? No, we're seeing them come from the University of Mary Washington. I think that the opportunities are there for the places that don't have the giant brand names and the multi-billion-dollar budgets, because they're involved in preparing their students for living in the world primarily, and I think that's very exciting. I see the innovations coming from the individuals like Gardner and Jim, and spreading to others. That's one of the reasons for this course, not from the institution top down. Although I guess, Gardner, you are the institution top down in your case. So, I think that in the best case scenario, the people who run institutions will eventually hear the voices of the people who have been experimenting for some years now, and begin to adopt policies that would enable them to do what they're doing. The not so great case scenario, I think, is the kind of panicked and stupid way that big institutions reacted to the early MOOCs, thinking, oh, okay, here's this business that's going to threaten us. We've got to go make all of our lectures online. Hey, that's great. It's wonderful to have all those lectures online. That's not the future of education. It's part of it.
Yeah. In terms of cultural barriers, I think that one of them is this question of assessment and evaluation. So we ran into this way back at your faculty workshop at UMW, and we talked to some faculty about why not just connect kids directly into Wikipedia and have them engage with the ongoing evolution of this particular area, as opposed to spin up a wiki for the purpose of the class, have a hermetically sealed interaction within it, and then shut it down at the end of the class. And the reaction was, probably still often would be, well, how else can we evaluate it? And so I think that actually, to me, looks like a really big challenge. I mean, clearly the hybrid model is going to be what everyone is going to need going forward, right? You're going to have some MOOC content and experiences that are relatively canned, and you're going to have a residential experience in the classroom, and those things are going to be connected in some ways. But you need to be able to evaluate the ways in which the students are living in the network, and the network, is global, right? And you have to accept that, and you have to figure out how are we going to assess and evaluate what happens in that context. And that's hard, right? I mean, I don't pretend that there is an easy answer to that, but it has to happen.
Well, and it's entirely possible that really deep thoughts about assessment have simply not been present in the pretty routinized experience of the signature pedagogy. You hand this in, you do this thing, a grade is assigned, but to what extent that's actually reflecting something larger about the nature of learning, maybe those questions don't come up as often as they should. My own hope is that there's something still at least potentially subversive and bracing and inspiring about the World Wide Web, that it could have an effect of maybe breaking some of these log jams. The kind of effort I'm involved in right here along those lines, as a top-down administrator, yes, is trying to start a conversation about the possibilities of connected learning. And it's interesting to see what happens when we talk about integrative thinking as a goal for students. It's a common belief, and I would share it myself in an earlier version of myself, that, well, then it would be the teacher's responsibility to create all the conditions in which the integrative thinking would happen, understand exactly how that was put together and how to grade it from the get-go, instead of establishing a kind of a commons for the students themselves to begin to experiment with what it's like to integrate their own experience as they have it, narrating their learning. And by the time I get to the point I've just gotten to, I realize that I'm speaking a different language, and one that it saddens me to think about being a different language, because I also think it's at the heart of what higher ed is supposed to be doing. It's at the heart of what most mission statements profess. But it's as if the infrastructure we have built to do the thing that is possibly an idealistic and altruistic worthy goal has ended up smothering it. That's the fate of most organizations. I hope it isn't the fate of the World Wide Web or of the future of learning, even the future of higher ed. But I guess we'll find out. What was that phrase you used, Howard, with the uncertainty in it? That's a great phrase. I just want to hear it again.
Critical uncertainty.
We're in a moment of critical uncertainty with regard to higher ed. My fear is that if higher ed goes, the space right now in which we're gathered to try to work on these questions won't exist anymore. I can't see Procter & Gamble or the Bank of America or maybe even Google sponsoring this space out of the kindness of their hearts, although we are benefiting from Google Hangouts right now. So there are paradoxes there too. Any parting thoughts from either of you? Any valedictions? Anything that will help us go forward and do this work we have in front of us?
Well, the grain of sand analogy, you can pile up grains of sand, and one one more grain of sand will cause a cascade. I think that people need to understand that what they do matters, that each one of us is that grain of sand that's going to cause a cascade. The enormous forces, the governments, the corporations, the universities that are trying to shape this space have tremendous power, but they would not have this power at all. The space would not exist at all if it wasn't for a bunch of individuals putting up websites. You know, at the beginning, there was a lot of people with pictures of their dogs and their cats, linking to others. You don't have to be a great architect. You just need to put one of the bricks in place.
I'm just praying my battery is going to last because I had to switch PCs to do this conversation. I'm pretty low. I just want to thank you guys for putting this together. I feel hopeful talking to you folks.
And I to the two of you. Thanks to Jon Udell and Howard Rheingold for being part of the webinar today. There's been a very lively Twitter stream going that we'll all be able to feast on when this is done. I've kept looking out of the corner of my eye, which always gives me a shifty look on the webinar. But thanks so much for all your contributions, lifelong and today as well. And thanks to the Connected Courses community for helping this conversation to matter. Adieu.
Bye-bye.